these 5 men convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage in the United States, and yet they said they were here, yes, spying, but spying on violent anti-Cuba groups.
They were here working with the United States government to try and stop the right-wing groups in Florida from continuing to invade Cuba through sending arms down to Cuba, from flying over the island, and from actually killing people on the island. There was an explosion at a hotel, and many people were killed. So they were working with the cooperation of the American government. Let me just say one thing before I get into that. There's a lawyer whose name hasn't been mentioned, Lenny Weinglass, who you know very well. And before me, Lenny worked for 10 years on the Cuban Five case. One of the great American lawyers, and whatever the result here is, he certainly is owed something for it, at least an acknowledgement.
He died a few years ago.
He died a few years ago. Wonderful lawyer. And then, after Elian Gonzalez in Florida, and at the same time as you had the Bush-Gore vote in Florida, it became necessary to find someone to blame for some killings which occurred in 1996. My client was ultimately arrested and then convicted. He was arrested 3.5 years for allegedly the killings after the incident occurred, although the American government had all this information for some 3.5 years prior to that. And then ultimately he's charged, and the first time there's a conviction, the appellate court reverses the conviction because the jury was unfairly composed of people hostile to the Cuban government. And then,
you said that they worked with the U.S. government. Explain.
They worked with the U.S. government. They were turning information over to the U.S. government of terrorist activities done by the right wing. And that information was being spread, and there was, in fact, meetings in Havana between the American government and representatives of the WASP group who were exchanging information.
And President Obama said in his address about the release of these 3 men that the release, well, he didn't name Trujillo, the Cuban agent working for the CIA who's held by Cuba for something like 20 years, who was just released yesterday. But he said that that spy for the U.S. had helped give them information that led to the imprisonment of the Cuban Five.
Yes.
I wanted to turn for a moment to Rene Gonzalez, to this Democracy Now! Exclusive. He was the first of the men to be freed, the Cuban Five. In October 2011, returned to Cuba last year. He joined us on Democracy Now! From Havana, Cuba, and I began by asking him why he did come to the United States to investigate militant Cuban exile groups.
Well, for my generation, Cubans, it was part of our development or common experience to have seen people coming from Miami, raiding our shores, shooting at hotels, killing people here in Cuba, blowing up airplanes. So we were really familiar with the terrorist activities that the Cuban people have been suffering for almost 40 years back then. So it wasn't hard for me to accept the mission of going there and monitor the activities of some of those people who had been trained by the CIA in the 60s. Some of them have participated in Bay of Pigs. Some of them had after that, had gone to South America as part of the Operation Condor. And if you look at the history of those people, you can see them linked to the worst actions of the U.S. government, be it the Iran-Contras, even the Kennedy assassination plot was linked to them. So it wasn't hard for me to accept the mission and to go there to protect the Cuban people's lives, and that's what I did.
That was Rene Gonzalez. He has been now living back in Cuba for a few years, one of the Cuban Five. Now all 5 are back in Cuba. Less is well known in this country, or certainly in the last 24 hours. There's almost no real discussion of who these men are. Much more attention paid to Alan Gross, who was the USAID subcontractor, who went down to Cuba and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served 5 of those years and was released yesterday. Martin Garbus.
Robert Gross was
Alan Gross.
Pardon me. Alan Gross was a USAID employee. He was sent down with satellite equipment consistently. He made about 6 trips down there, sometimes using other people to send equipment. And the equipment was used to allow people on the island to directly communicate with the United States so that the Cuban security networks or the Cuban internet lines would not pick it up. So it was the setting up of a spy operation within Cuba. He was supported because he was Jewish by Jewish groups. He originally claimed that he was down there working on behalf of Jewish groups to spread information to other Jewish groups in Miami. He ultimately admitted that that wasn't true. He ultimately sued the American government for sending him down there without warning him specifically about what was going to happen to him. So there's very little question any longer that he was sent down by the government. He said he was sent down by the government. The government admitted it. And in America, he's portrayed as something other than that, but that portrayal is wrong.
Peter Kornblue, you met with Alan Gross in prison in Cuba. Is that right?
Yes, I met with Alan Gross twice over a one-year period for a total of 7 hours. He was in a military hospital, a wing of a military hospital. Had been converted to a prison. We talked a lot about what he was doing, what he was feeling. He became very angry at his own government for abandoning him here for all these years. It is clear for the last year, through back-channel means, the Obama White House has been negotiating to get him out. My sense of talking to him was that his mental state was so fragile that he might actually go on a hunger strike and die, attempt some type of suicide escape plan and be hurt or killed, or attack a guard. And all of that would have, anything that happened to him here in a Cuban military prison would have certainly compromised any possibility of the Obama administration moving forward, as it did yesterday, on completely changing, reversing course 180% the history of U.S. Cuban relations, bearing the perpetual antagonism of the past and moving forward to a normal relation in the future. So getting Alan Gross out through this prisoner exchange was extremely important. It really was the first step. But what we saw yesterday is the Obama White House deciding to do an entire package all at the same time, not doing one step at a time to change U.S.-Cuban relations, but getting Alan Gross out, returning the Cuban spies to Cuba, and then essentially ending, to the degree that the president can, the hostility and the aggression in U.S. policy towards Cuba.